All right, we are here with George Selgin. He's going to talk to us today about cryptocurrencies, money, economics, and a whole bunch of other theories that are very fascinating. George, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, Peter. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Great, great. And for the folks at home that aren't too familiar with your work, can you give a background?
Well, I'm an economist who works on monetary policy, theory, history, and I've been doing that for quite a long time, mostly as an academic, but nowadays I direct the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives here in Washington, D.C.
Great, great. And we were brought together by a force of serendipity in that you popped into the Bitcoin world in a big way when you debated not too long ago Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, some say the seminal work when it comes to describing the economic theory behind Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. And you took the position in that debate that Bitcoin might not be well suited to replace government money. And it was a very interesting debate, a lot of good rebuttals back and forth. Saifedean ultimately won in terms of the audience vote. However, in terms of the intellectual debate, I was hoping that we could continue that on and explore some more of your thoughts in detail. So what
Sure,
did you think
of
about
course.
that debate?
Well, first of all, the one thing that I think a lot of people may have misunderstood is what my overall sentiments are about Bitcoin. I think a lot of people assume that because I was taking the well, it was the affirmative on the proposition, but the proposition was that Bitcoin is not suited to take over any country's money as any country's money. A lot of people assume that meant that I was anti-Bitcoin or not sympathetic to the idea, and that's a misconception. I wish I had done a better job uh, combating at the beginning of the debate. I'm actually quite favorable to Bitcoin in most of the ways that should count. I don't want the government to do anything that can stand in the way of its succeeding, whether as currency or as the basis for other kinds of transactions. And I was a fan of Bitcoin early on because I like to see private market innovations doing everything possible to challenge established government money monopolies and possibly provide people with better alternatives. Moreover, I think Bitcoin does provide people, some people certainly, with alternatives with an alternative they do consider better, which is why it has established a niche market, and it's why it's used as a medium of exchange to some important extent. So all of those things are ways in which I like Bitcoin. Nevertheless, I did feel comfortable debating safety on that proposition about Bitcoin's suitability to really take over a country's as a country's main medium of exchange. And the reason I felt compelled to do that is because I do think that a lot of people in the Bitcoin community underestimate the challenge that involves, underestimate just what Bitcoin's up against. And I wanted the opportunity to clarify some of the major hurdles that it has to overcome, that any private currency would have to overcome in order to really displace to an important extent an established official money.
Yes, and I did sense in that debate there was some talking past one another, and that you
Indeed.
would put forward this point. You weren't exactly disagreeing with the idea that competition of currencies can be a very good thing, but it was more about what is this challenge? Why is the incumbent traditional system there? What keeps it up, and what is preventing a new challenger from taking it over?
Exactly. I think competition is a very good thing, but it doesn't follow that it's easy for a rival to compete against a well-established incumbent currency. And now, one of the things that I think people were very confused about was precisely this notion of what it means for anything to become a country's money, that is, its most generally accepted medium of exchange. Now, for economists, that has a very definite meaning. It means that it's going to be used, or that stuff denominated in it's going to be used to make most payments, to settle most exchanges. Of course, that's what dollars do, and US dollars do in the United States today. It doesn't, the success of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is something that isn't measured by how much it appreciates in the marketplace. And I think a lot of people are really confused by that. That is, they see that Bitcoin has appreciated, well, tremendously, of course, since it was first introduced, but that it also, despite ups and downs, seems to have some ability to sustain this appreciation. And there are perfectly good economic reasons to suspect that it might have better appreciation potential in the very long run than any fiat money, for the simple reason that we know perfectly well all fiat monies are depreciating all the time. They can do that forever, by the way, because money can lose half its value every year. It doesn't run out, right? And of course, they're depreciating. Most fiat monies are depreciating much more slowly. But to get back to the main point, something can have a remarkable ability to earn returns, can be in that sense a successful store of value, and more so than any fiat money, and yet it can still have a hard time displacing an established fiat money, as something that people use routinely to pay for stuff. And my point in the debate, and what should have been the point, was addressing the question of the medium of exchange role, and how hard it will be for Bitcoin to play that on a grand national scale. That's what the debate. So I think a lot of people, and this is probably, I'm going to generalize it a lot here. I'm going to make a sweeping generalization.
We're fine with that. Go for it.
I think a lot of Bitcoiners are very sensitive to questions about whether the asset they like so much is going to continue to appreciate. So we have the hodler phenomenon, right? And so they look at somebody like me and say, here's a guy who doesn't think the value is going to go up, maybe even would like to see it go down. Maybe he's even talking it down right now. And that has nothing to do with what I'm arguing here. I have no good advice to offer anyone on whether to hold Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin. I'm happy if its value goes up. I think its value can continue to go up. My doubts only concern how widespread its use in payments is likely to become, particularly in countries like the United States that don't have basket case national official currencies.
And I think this was the crux of the issue, that the prompt of the debate and what you were mainly arguing was around that concept of, yes, there are arguments to be made. Can the demand go up? Can the price go up? Can a speculative asset keep getting speculated on? Mm-hmm. But the real question at hand was, can you actually use this in commerce? Can it be easy, convenient, cheap, and make sense for the ordinary consumer? And that's where it seemed like Saifedean was kind of going off and not really addressing that too much, and trying to go into, well, because it's valuable, central banks around the world will end up unifying in their adoption of it, and then there will be all these layers that are built around it, and ultimately yes, the layers are where the actual medium of exchange occur.
Well, I would like to say in favor of what Saifedean is arguing there, that I think he's fundamentally correct to say that the convenience of Bitcoin itself in what I guess you might call first layer
Hmm.
transactions, right? Which is where you're not relying on Lightning or some other secondary layer device to uh, lower the costs of transactions. The the convenience of Bitcoin or the costliness of transferring Bitcoin in that first layer isn't necessarily itself what's going to determine how popular Bitcoin can be in general payments because of second layer technologies like Lightning. So it's a huge question how far those other layer technologies can go, how popular can become, and how much more easily people will be able, and cheaply people will be able to transact with Bitcoin because of them. So that is a huge question mark. I expressed doubts, about whether these technologies can really make Bitcoin competitive in the eyes of the masses of people. It's already popular again among some people, but we're talking about the average person who doesn't have the same concerns. A lot of people don't care about whether their transactions are decentralized or not. They don't care whether Big Brother knows everything they're up to. They don't care about some of the other issues that Bitcoin fans are concerned about. We have to recognize that, and we have to ask, what is it going to take to get those people to climb on board the Bitcoin bandwagon? And I think that Saifedean is quite right. It's these second layer developments are going to be crucial. He's more optimistic about how far they can go in attracting a market share for Bitcoin and building on its market share than I am, but he's certainly correct that that's where the action is.
True. And there, although I would suggest there is a false equivalency in suggesting that the accounting books that are centralized within a Venmo, a payment processor, XYZ that is out there, um, that going on in their internal ledger is actually the medium of exchange that is occurring. It's not actually Bitcoins getting passed around. It's not actually the settlement that goes on the blockchain. And so that's where I think Saifedean really gets into the problem, because going back to the prompt and to many of the points that you raised, this is about, can Bitcoin be actually used for the medium of exchange? Store of value is a little bit of a separate discussion. If it can go up or down, it can retain value. You also mentioned it's not too great at retaining that value either.
If
So
you don't
yeah,
like volatility, it's not so hot. That's right. And ordinary people don't want to have uh, the asset that they're using in exchange, which they have to have some of on hand at all times, but they don't want to necessarily think of that as an item of their investment portfolio. They'd like that just to be very safe stuff that doesn't bounce around in value very much, so they don't have to worry that they'll have to bear losses as an incidental result of this being money, right? So people don't like that. On the other hand, to get back to that point about first versus second layer, I, I I think that if we're judging something's capacity to become money, we have to let the derivatives count. I think Saifedean's right. If we think about the gold standard, and he makes this comparison all the time, and it's a very valid one. If the only way you could have gold-based dollars was to have gold coins themselves, let alone gold bullion, bricks, uh, certainly we would consider gold a very poor, high transactions cost medium of exchange, particularly for large payments. But we know that we can have substitutes, paper, book entry, etc. And it was thanks to those that gold became money in a big way. It wasn't because gold itself became the main medium of exchange. It's because gold plus its substitutes did. And I think we should look at Bitcoin the same way. That if I'm perfectly willing to grant that it's sufficient that uh, equivalents to Bitcoin, whether on books of various uh, 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 financial intermediaries or otherwise, that if those can be popular, then Bitcoin's popular. It doesn't have to be that people are using the real stuff, so to speak, which in this case isn't very real. It's
yeah.
digital, but you know what I mean. So I'm okay with that. I still think, though, that it's even if we allow for all the second layer possibilities, there are tremendous hurdles that have to be overcome for any rival currency to unseat an incumbent, well-established one. And this goes into those network effects that I tried to emphasize in the debate. Those effects so strongly in favor an entrenched money, especially an official one, that it takes extreme circumstances for any alternative currency to really build a substantial following.
Yeah,
We
and
can
I
talk
think
about that more, but
yeah, I think that was probably the most crucial point that you made when you talk about the network effects and getting to the point where you need value within the network, you need the users to grow, you need the engagement between those users. There's an argument in terms of like velocity of money that goes on within like the closed loop Bitcoin economy that's pretty interesting. But outside of that, going back to the layers, do you think it's perhaps a misnomer to describe first layer, second layer in terms of the Bitcoin blockchain and Light Network, when I just want to highlight one of the descriptions that Saifedean makes of the 100% saturated hypothetical Bitcoin universe. You can find it in his blog post. He talks about, let's say we get to that point, and based on the calculations that he's done, back of the envelope, it comes to about 850 central bank like entities are actually operating on the Bitcoin base chain because the fees are so high. Obviously, everyone can see where this is going. There's limited block space. There's only a certain number of blocks per day. And so the fees will jack up, and the only people that can afford those fees will be large institutions that will end up interacting with either individual consumers or payment processors like the Lightning Network. So what ends up happening is you actually have the layer one, which is the actual blockchain, the layer two, which is the 850 central bank-like entities, which Saifedean admits and describes. And then they have their own internal centralized ledgers. And then everyone else on the layer three, which is Lightning Network and all these individual other payment processors. So do you think that's a more accurate description?
it sounds quite plausible to me. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about how these things will develop. I mean, even Lightning Network is still so young. But yes, I think that's not implausible at all. We're going to have a lot of transaction if Bitcoin were to develop the way that other currencies that are themselves somewhat, let's say, clumsy to directly exchange with. Uh, we build, you see financial institutions develop that specialize in providing alternative arrangements that are low cost, but that provide equivalents to the clunky stuff that are just as convenient and in some for certain purposes more convenient. I think that what appeals to people about Bitcoin is the idea that unlike gold, you can move it digitally. And that is true, and that's a lot better than gold. However, as we've learned, you can't move it that cheaply by itself. And so the need for these alternative arrangements still exists. The fact that it isn't a physical commodity has not changed things as much as one might first have expected. We've learned that the cost structure is such that there's still room for innovation. And so I agree with Saifedean. One place where we disagree, at first I didn't realize this, but I subsequently found out. I had assumed that fairly conventional banks could also play a role in a Bitcoin world, Bitcoin-based banking, in other words. And I thought that Saifedean also viewed this as not only possible but probably desirable. It turns out he doesn't think that. He doesn't think ordinary banks or enterprises that operate similarly but on a Bitcoin basis are desirable. And I don't know whether he thinks they're even likely, but I suspect that institutions like that would be part of the layers that we're talking about, and they resemble that middle layer that you were talking about, components of that layer. I don't know whether you would only have a small or large number. We're still trying to figure out how many banks the US banking system can sustain. We still, if you count credit unions, we've got 11,000 banks and credit unions, which is a ridiculously large number, actually. I think that it's probably fair to say that Bitcoin banking would not involve so many institutions, but a much smaller set. But how many, I couldn't venture to guess.
Yeah, well, and this gets to sort of looking at Saifedean's analysis as, what makes Bitcoin so unique compared to the existing system if there's sort of a lot of the same processes where there's going to have to be trust that is placed in those institutions that are managing
Absolutely,
the
yes. It
blockchain.
is. You cannot, you can have a trustless system, if you don't mind me just calling plain old Bitcoin
Yeah.
that. You can have a trustless system, but you cannot have a very low transaction cost trustless medium of exchange with Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to choose. So people can have their trustless transacting, but they're going to pay a price for it, either in time or in actual fees. Whereas if they want to get away from those fees or those delays, they're going to be able to do so only uh, by mustering up trust for some intermediaries of various kinds. And that's a point I tried to make in the debate. And I think it was compressed into, Selgin thinks lightning depends on trust in some particular way. That isn't the point, but there is a more general trade-off here that where trust becomes more important as you seek lower fee, faster transactions.
Trust is a spectrum.
Yes,
And
it is.
that's how we should think about. And so going back to what you said, that the network effects are very important, and how you have a large network, you have a small network, and there was the example brought up during the debate of, gold outplaced wampum, not because gold was harder money, but because gold was the larger network compared to the small network of wampum.
I think that's right. When you think about, of course, one again has to really generalize here, but you think about the people come from Europe to North America in the 15th century and early 16th century. Yes, of course, at first they're trading with locally with goods and services that local people desire. But over time, it becomes more convenient for the locals to adopt the medium of exchange that the foreigners themselves covet. And you do have a tendency for the money that was commanded the biggest network in the first place to then be adopted in the smaller network that becomes integrated with the first. And so I think that's why we didn't end up with wampum. If we had ended up with wampum, it would have had to be because Europe ended up with wampum, so everybody's going to use wampum. So those network forces are very, very important. And as economies become more integrated, the tendency is for one vast network to assert itself, and for smaller ones to die out or to be relegated to little niches here and there. And then, and really, if people want to grasp the importance of network effects in monetary choice, the best way is for them to be aware of cases of hyperinflation, where those are the only cases where you typically find an established money dying out and being replaced by something else. But the very fact that it only happens in hyperinflations illustrates the strength of network economies, because for a long time, people are clinging to these terrible, rapidly depreciating currencies, even though there's lots of other stuff around that's not appreciating very much. I mean, depreciating very much, and that could be used as means of exchange. Now, why do they do that? Because it's very difficult to break out of an established network. If people could all do it in concert, that would be one thing. But in practice, they all feel stuck until things get so desperate that they finally can make a move.
And one of the advantage of fiat currencies is the fact that they kind of have a great jumpstart when it comes to demand stimulation. It's the legal tender. All taxes need to be paid in this. And so there's this just gigantic network effect that is automatically placed on the population.
Right. People can and do exaggerate the legal tender angle, but it's not irrelevant. It's very important. Mostly what legal tender means in practice is that money has to be used in settling debts that are already outstanding. It doesn't have a lot of power to compel people to accept a particular money in regular spot transactions. But public acceptability, which is related but not quite the same, that's important. If a government says you can pay your taxes in dollars but not in anything else, well, what it has done is to create one big network member.
Mm-hmm.
And that big network member has, attractive power, makes it more convenient. It's not that government in this sense is any different than Walmart, but it's like 10 Walmarts because it's big.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a government that already is, as it were, stacking the deck in favor of its money, but that money's also just well established everywhere else, and it's not hyperinflating, it's not terrible, it's just not great, any upstart currency is going to have a very hard time, even if the government doesn't otherwise interfere with it, unsaddling that established currency. That's just a very, very, very big challenge. It's a huge challenge.
And that's where we get into perhaps price is just the wrong number to be looking at altogether. I mean, of course, we don't want something that is volatile, but we also want to look at, what are the number of users in the network? What is the distribution? What is the engagement between them? Like, how actively are they trading per day, per week, per month? And how can we judge the actual network versus some speculation about its future value?
Right. You can't tell how successful Bitcoin or anything else is as a money or as a medium of exchange, other than by asking and trying to answer the question, how many people are ready to accept it for the stuff they have to sell, for their labor, for goods? How many people are ready, have that Bitcoin accepted here sign out there? And there are many now that do, but it's still small. That dimension, if that's the dimension where Bitcoin's progress has not been all that it's been spectacular in the sense that a lot of people wouldn't have expected to have any progress at all at the beginning. So it has been spectacular, but it hasn't, if you compare the size of the Bitcoin network measured that way, let alone by the actual numbers of transactions in ordinary exchanges, to the success of established monies, it's very small. So that's the right comparison. I've seen these comparisons where people look at the capitalization of Bitcoin, and say, look, it's the 10th largest money in the world. No, it's not. It's an asset that has a capital value that's that ranks 10th among things that you could call currency. It doesn't mean that it is the 10th most important currency, because it's not really current at all in that economist sense of being generally accepted in exchange. We could say if we called Microsoft shares money, I think we would say that has a better capitalization than Bitcoin. But the point here isn't what's the capitalization, it's is it money or not, and to what extent? That's the question that the debate was addressing, how much more could it become money, and to the extent whether it could do so to the extent of driving out or really giving a hard time to established monies.
Yeah, and if the thesis of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies at large is that there is a fundamental problem with the existing paradigm of monetary systems, and we are the dissidents that are out to disrupt that. If we are the disruptors, we're inherently at the edge of the network, and there's a center, and what we basically want to do is distribute the center over here to this new edge.
Yes.
And make that center that's today the edge. And so when that happens, you think, well, the only way that you really have any sort of advantage at growing, or the strategy at how you increase the size of that edge network, is you have to look at, well, who is the center actually pushing out of itself? And so that's where you look in, well, why did Bitcoin's value get bootstrapped back in the day? And to a lot of people's chagrin, it was a lot of black market activity that was people pushed outside of the traditional paradigm.
That's exactly right. That's how Bitcoin got a foothold. That is a niche that is still one that it is able to satisfy better than many established monies. And there have been other areas like that for a while at least, and still to some extent. International remittances have been a kind of payment that Bitcoin has done relatively well at. So it has its niches, it's doing well, and those are the footholds that are crucial for there to be any hope of a currency, as it were, marching its way toward the center that you're talking about. You've got to establish a beachhead first. And Bitcoin's done that. It's a remarkable achievement. It's absolutely remarkable achievement. But it's a little bit like Anzio, once you get there on the beach, you've got a lot of hard slogging to go, because the enemy is up on top of a mountain and looking down on you, right?
Yeah.
So this is the thing that I'm trying to drive home. My message isn't give up now, right? Surrender Dorothy, whatever. It's not. It's, hey, let's not talk about this as if it's already a fait accompli, as if this is just going to be a milk run. The value's doing well, the price is going up, so we win. I think that it's very important for people to recognize the challenges ahead in the Bitcoin community, but in the blockchain community generally, and not to be complacent, because they're going to have a lot of innovating to do and a lot of effort ahead to make further progress and to try to get to that center. I would like to see them succeed. They may not succeed in this country. They might succeed in Venezuela. And certainly if they succeed in a country like that, a lot of people will be better off because of it. So I want these things that I'm saying are tough, are difficult, probably won't happen. I want to see them happen. I want them to certainly be possible. But I don't think they're more likely to happen if you have people thinking that they've already happened,
Yes.
which is what's going on to, I think, a worrisome degree in the blockchain community.
Yeah, and it is helpful to have your competitor kicking customers out into your direction. So that's an interesting phenomenon. And speaking on Venezuela, we here at CoinSpice, we actually have a reporter that's down there. He writes pretty interesting on-the-ground stories of what's happening. And the interesting angle that we really haven't seen in the mainstream press when it comes to anything regarding the basket case like countries, Venezuela, you can point to a few others when it comes to, hey, look, they're looking to Bitcoin as a hedge asset because their domestic currency is inflating away and they're trying to get into something that's actually a store of value. What I find more interesting, kind of having an intimate view of it and also just thinking a little bit differently, is that for whatever degree that there is a uptick, let's say in Bitcoin trading or Bitcoin volume when it comes to those areas, when like a big inflation event happens, is it not because they're looking for a hedge, but they're saying there's so much chaos going on in the system that I can't trust businesses to actually like move my money around effectively. And also the United States and the powers that be are sanctioning many services from actually interacting with me as a Venezuelan national. So I need to turn to censorship resistant payment networks where I can actually get in, move my money to another account, and then get out in a different currency as fast as possible. And this is where what we do know is that many Venezuelans were moving large sums of money out of Venezuela into neighboring Colombia and Brazil, and they were trying to exit in that direction. So it doesn't seem that store of value is the assumed experience that those people were using it for. It was more of, we need to get in and out as fast as possible and just use it for the pure transfer functionality.
Right. Well, yes, no, I think you're quite right. That is not people just thinking of Bitcoin as an investment in the ordinary sense. And it illustrates the point that in basket case countries like Venezuela, that is where the network effects are weak, and where upstart currencies like Bitcoin have potential to gain ground, particularly if, again, like Bitcoin, they can be moved more easily than others with less, with more privacy, which is extremely important in cases like Venezuela's. So it's a perfect environment. If it's not going to grow in an environment like that, I think Bitcoin's prospects would be truly, truly dismal. But it is, and it is succeeding in those places.
Anyway, so let's just get right back into it. We were talking about Venezuela and how it was really just perhaps used as a transfer mechanism, and you were opining about that.
Example of how in a place where you really have a deteriorating established currency, the network attractiveness of that currency starts to crumble. And that's when upstarts can start to make inroads, and that's exactly what's happening with Bitcoin. And I was adding that Bitcoin's features make it particularly attractive in that kind of environment where an oppressive government may be trying to prevent people from moving their wealth, particularly out of the country. So this is just exactly the right sort of environment for Bitcoin to take off, not as an investment, but as a medium of exchange. And it's good to see that happening, because if it didn't happen in an environment like that, odds are that it wouldn't happen elsewhere. But it's still, of course, we're still a long way from seeing Bitcoin take over Venezuela, and we're that much further away from seeing it take over Switzerland and most other countries. So it's good, it's progress, and it gives some hope for the future. But again, every possible development that can improve the overall attractiveness of Bitcoin, including by keeping the costliness of employing it, either alone or with the complementary software and or intermediaries, is going to help a great deal. It's extremely important. We should also, on this discussion, Peter, one of the things that came up in the debate was, well, you know, Bitcoin, you can have these real-time instant transactions, which of course is certainly true for layer one transactions. If you if you pay enough, you can have an instant real-time transfer. But it's also true that in the world of ordinary national currencies, the speed of payments is rapidly increasing. The US is actually a bit of a laggard compared to many other countries, but even in the United States now we have a number of alternatives for real-time retail payments, and we're going to be having more and more of them soon. Yes, the networks in some of these cases are limited as well, but they're relatively easy networks to take advantage of without leaving the incumbent currency system. So Bitcoin really can't claim that it offers uniquely fast means for payment or means for real-time payment. Those means exist for many other currencies as well. So the features, if developers of Bitcoin and Bitcoin-related technology are looking to make it especially attractive, they're going to be having to push other parts of the envelope, not just speed.
True. And that's where, when we can compare, okay, instant settlement, instant payment, that's not exactly what's happening. There's a mechanism of settlement, block time, confirmations that go on.
True. That's right.
that create a bit of a hurdle. So if that's not really the compelling, overwhelming feature set that is attractive to new users, then the question is, well, what is? And perhaps is the primary innovation that Bitcoin figured out was censorship-resistant value transfer.
I'm sure that that is definitely, if not the most, one of the most important, unique features of Bitcoin. And it's, again, it is one of its secrets of success. There's no question about it. But there are large segments of the market for media of exchange that are not yet all that concerned about those issues. Mm-hmm. The way the Bitcoin community, to speak of it that way, is. We have that community has a disproportionate share of libertarians, mm-hmm. people otherwise sensitive to the encroachments of the state on privacy, worried about where those encroachments are heading in the future. They may simply be, we may simply be talking about people who are, as it were, ahead of schedule relative to others. That is, that other people really need to better appreciate the dangers of dealing with incumbent currencies. I think this is, for example, Nick Szabo's point of view, is that, if you're playing with fire when you're playing with this ordinary, well-established stuff. And you're going to eventually learn the hard way that that's a bad idea. So it could be that sensibilities about those things generally change in a direction that makes it easier for Bitcoin to climb Mount Improbable, so to speak, and overcome the established network advantages of existing currencies. I'm sure that feature of Bitcoin will be very important, will remain important, but everything that can be done to increase its attractiveness along other dimensions is also going to help a lot.
Yeah, and that's perhaps where some Bitcoiners go wrong, where they see that the roadmap for where the software needs to go is somewhere that doesn't actually improve those other sets that contribute to the main value prop, which is how do we make sure that this is being used, that people can easily, without unusual cumbersomeness, go in and use this to transfer value around. And especially when it comes to the censorship resistant quality, just to emphasize that again, that you see a lot of people when it's in Venezuela or in some other countries, there's sanctioning going on, there's censorship, there's bank accounts getting closed, payment processors, removing customers, and people are getting exited from the existing network. And so that's really Bitcoin's, open pitch to play mm-hmm. in. And anything that sort of handicaps that ability to go there really sort of takes it away from actually having organic growth.
Right. In those dire circumstances, of course, people are willing to pay a pretty good percentage.
And that's why they don't care about volatility. They're willing to eat that.
Well, they're willing to eat that, and they're willing to eat those transfer costs too, to move Bitcoin around. It's worth it under those circumstances, but I think it's nobody wants to wait till you have such circumstances to see Bitcoin succeed in a big way, mm-hmm, and so the big challenge is to see what it can accomplish in situations that seem relatively stable, where the incumbent currencies don't seem especially terrifying, and to see if it can't make inroads more quickly in those situations. I think that this is a question, of course, about future technological innovations within the Bitcoin realm. And I think it would be a mistake for me to pretend that by pointing out all the difficulties involved, that I'm going to be pushing people to do more technological innovation. I should say, I'm sure that the incentives are already there and that I'm not adding a whit to them. Still, I do think it's desirable for those who aren't engaged in those innovations to appreciate their importance, and that there's still a lot of room for improvement. I think you were right to suggest a little while ago, I think you were suggesting it, that too many people are assuming that Bitcoin's censorship-proof nature alone is going to cause it to become much more popular in the near future, because people are going to become more conscious of the need to have a censorship-proof transacting. Uh, that could happen, but I don't think it's going to happen very much in most countries. I hope we don't see the kind of world where it does happen, actually, because that would probably mean governments have really upped their game when it comes to interfering with people's privacy.
Well, it is an interesting conundrum when you look at the state versus the market and how this is happening, and I don't think it's that controversial to look at examples where private banks were actually looking at removing the services from organizations or directly the NRA. And so I mean, I think everyone can have their opinion on the NRA. I think a lot of libertarians would most likely suggest it's probably a good thing to have an advocacy group for that amendment. Uh, but if such an institution that is relatively mainstream in the political spectrum is getting their financial ability removed overnight, I mean, this is where it's almost, again, it's sort of this kicking customers out of your own store seems like the ultimate foothold on the beach that Bitcoiners can reach for, and finding ways to interact with those types of demographics and customer types is the route they need to go, versus sort of this other route of which I believe Saifedean and the rest of his school of thought on the matter suggest, you need to kind of pivot towards institutional investors and get them to have buy-in, as well as existing central banks of governments around the world will see the value proposition and then race to accumulate Bitcoin.
Well, that latter, those ideas, those last ideas, they're fine as far as trying to make Bitcoin popular as an investment. It has nothing to do with the medium of exchange. It has nothing to do with making Bitcoin become money. Central banks are notorious hoarders of gold. They've convinced themselves, or they've been convinced, that having a lot of gold in their portfolio is a good idea. Is that helping gold to become money again? Not at all. Not at all. It has nothing to do with it. And so, yes, we can talk about it. We can talk about institutional investors getting into Bitcoin. But talking about that is just like talking about getting them to buy more Microsoft shares or whatever. It has nothing to do with money in the economist sense of the term, which is my sense of the term, which is the sense of the term in the debate I had with Saifedean. So I just wish we could. It's not to say we can't talk about Bitcoin as an investment. That's fine, but let's not confuse promoting it as an investment and having it catch on as an investment with promoting it as money and having it catch on as money and making it a more attractive money. Those are very, very different things. And I think it's just one thing I wish I could have gotten through to people in the debate is if I were God, I can create the best investment vehicle in the world, I suppose, since I'm God, and I can create the best money in the world, but they won't look the same. They won't necessarily have the same features. And these are just two different ends that people wants to serve: the end of accumulating wealth, the end of being able to transfer wealth or exchange things, that are not necessarily best served by the same stuff. It's very basic economics.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you were able to expand on your points there, and hopefully anyone that also watched the debate is able to clarify their point of view if they had a misconception. But let's widen the scope a little bit, and we've mainly focused on Bitcoin, but there's other cryptocurrencies out there, and perhaps one that actually might fulfill a lot of the points that you talk about in the criticisms is the fact that we have Facebook coming to the land of crypto, and they're coming out with Libra, and it's a basket of fiat currencies, and they can flip a switch and turn on a huge network of billions of users and really have some serious competitive power when it comes to government. So, what do you think about Libra and Facebook?
Well, one thing that I think is that we mustn't confuse the size of the Libra network with the size of the Facebook network. They're not the same thing, and there is no switch that Facebook or Libra can flip that'll turn the Facebook network instantly into a Libra network. A currency network only exists to the extent that people actually use a currency. And by use a currency, I mean they're willing to accept it for stuff they have for sale. And they also are happy to offer it in exchange for stuff other people have to sell or for other payments. And just because somebody's on Facebook doesn't mean they're going to jump on the Libra bandwagon. Let's say I'm a merchant. I have a Facebook account, in fact, though I don't use it very much. But let's say I'm a merchant with a Facebook account, and I'm selling hot dogs. I've got a little cart on the sidewalk. So I've got a Facebook account, and Libra gets started. What does that mean? Suddenly I'm going to go out and I'm going to put a sign on my cart that says I'm selling my hot dogs for Libra because I'm on Facebook? I don't think so. I think I'm going to sell them. I'm not going to sell them for Libra unless I know what I'm going to be able to do with those Libra, which depends on what other people, etc. And now we're in the real network world. The real network world is where people ask, how many other people will take this stuff from me for the stuff I want? Mm-hmm. So it isn't that simple. I think that a lot of people who are making a big deal about Libra, and to some extent the Facebook folks themselves who are behind it, are grossly exaggerating the extent to which merely having an established network for purpose A means you can transform it like that into an equally large established network for purpose B. It doesn't work that way. By the way, the Federal Reserve has been engaging in a similar fallacy. We were saying we might talk about this, so I'm going to anticipate a little bit. They have a new payment system that they're planning to set up. It's only going to take them 5 years, and it's called FedNow. It's a real-time payment system, and they'll be competing head-on with an established retail payment system run by the Clearinghouse, the New York operation. Anyway, the Fed says, well, the Clearinghouse only has 30 people signed up, the biggest banks in the country, but still, we have a network of 11,000. That is, every bank and credit union already has an account at the Fed. They're saying, well, they're all already instantly in our real-time payments network. Well, that's also not true. It's like the Facebook thing, because actually, just because a bank has an account at the Fed doesn't mean it can automatically use this new payment service when it finally is established. It has to pay connection fees. It has to get software. It has to have a back office operation that handles things when the main bank is closed. There's all this other stuff. So none of those banks are going to be in the network when that thing first opens. They're going to have to do stuff to become part of that new network. And so it's exactly the same fallacy. So anyway, that's part of my talk about Libra. One other thing I'll say, since I've already talked too much, but I will say, I also am not quite sure the folks running Libra know exactly how it's supposed to work. It's still a bit of a black box how this basket of currencies is going to operate, how people will be able to trade currency units, established currencies for Libra, and how that exchange rate's worked out. I think they are working out the details as we speak. I'm pretty sure they didn't have those details worked out when they first announced Libra. And
Yeah.
therefore, it is not very easy to criticize Libra or to praise it, because you're dealing with something, the workings of which are still somewhat unclear.
And perhaps the only thing to glean from it that is of real value is the observation that this is perhaps a refreshing attitude from the marketplace and large corporations and a private interest getting together to say explicitly, we are going to start challenging the existing monetary system with our own, even though it's a basket of other fiat currencies, the fact that it is not solely the US dollar, that it is a combination, creates this irritation when it comes to the United States government. So I think that's perhaps the one of the most it's sort of like that's the first person to jump off, and now
Yes.
we're just waiting to see who jumps next.
Well, as is true in the case of Bitcoin, I reckon myself, for all my doubts or uncertainty about how Libra is going to work, I'm pro Libra. I'm bullish on Libra, not to say that I know it's going to succeed, but I welcome it because we need these challenges. And I frankly think that the reactions of official monetary authority to Libra are hysterical. And it really makes you wonder, if they have so little faith in their established currencies with their powerful network advantages, that they panic over a new and uncertain private venture that only proposes to mix up a bunch of those established currencies and create some kind of hybrid for people to use who think that has some advantage. If they can get that hysterical and worried about it, and already they're talking about how to stamp it out, that really says something about their lack of confidence in these established currencies. And that's all the more reason why we should look forward to Facebook's being able to give them a hard time. I really do think it's embarrassing how violent the reaction against Libra has been in official quarters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in comparison of both, we have a rough road ahead for not only a large institution like Facebook getting Libra started as a private currency, but also the decentralized community of Bitcoin and a lot of the other cryptocurrencies. But, while these areas, they're trying to solve huge technological challenges and almost doing, quantum physics, over here, trying to figure out how do we scale, how do we create layers of decentralization. You actually brought up a little bit more simplified point, especially when you mentioned the Fed's new payment system and why there's an issue around settlement times, and that it's not exactly a technological problem to begin with, why there's delays. So can you jump right into what is an immediate solution for that?
Right. So, all right. So the question is, what can we do to make payments faster in this country? Because there's some payments that take a long time to settle, right? You get the payment order, but you don't get the money right away, right? You get the check, you deposit, the money's 2 or 3 days later. All right. For certain purposes, what we really want is instantaneous or real-time payments. Those can really be advantageous for certain purposes. It makes life easy for inventory management, other things. You can transmit messages along with those payments. It has those instant payments. Payments are they're nice. We have some of them. We'd like to have more. That's great. They are, as it were, sort of the ne plus ultra of the payment system. However, that very high-tech type of payment isn't really necessary to satisfy the needs of most people. Most people don't mind having to wait an hour or two or whatever. When you hear the government complain about the slowness of payments, when you hear politicians talk about it, even when you hear the Fed talk about it, the rhetoric is, oh, some poor person puts a check on deposit on payday on Friday and can't get the money till Monday or Tuesday if there's a holiday, and then they go to payday lenders, or they have to suffer overdrafts because they didn't have enough money in their blah, 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 blah. Now, wait a minute. Here we're talking about delays in settlement that are not just a couple of hours, or it's a day or 2 days or 3 days or even 4 days. You don't need real-time payments for that. What you need is for the Federal Reserve to clean up its present act. What do I mean? Well, the reason those long delays happen is because the Federal Reserve runs most of the nation's final settlement services, and that's a byproduct of its having a monopoly of currency in this country. But in any event, the Fed has these wholesale payments systems. One's called the FedWire, the other one's called the National Settlement Service, and they're the ones who see to the settlement of payments among all the different financial institutions. And it's only when those settlements take place that any payments that have been processed through the system can finally be made. Right? The notices may have gone through, the information is there, but until FedWire or the National Settlement System or both do their thing, the banks don't get the money, and therefore, in many cases, they don't release it to their clients. Okay, so how come that can't happen, within minutes or hours or whatever? Because FedWire and the National Settlement Service are not open 24 hours a day. They're not open on weekends, and they're not open on holidays. So we don't need real-time payment systems, whether for the feds or the clearinghouses. Don't need any of that for the poor schlemiel who's got to wait 4 days for his check to clear. All you need is for these established Federal Reserve wholesale settlement services to be open on holidays and weekends, and also it would help if they were open 24 hours a day, so that payments can be processed, after 9 o'clock at night. And the Fed knows how to do that. It's not that it's super easy, but it's not that hard. They've been thinking about it for years. They've been encouraged to do it for years and years and years. And lately, in their announcement about how they're going to fix the slow payments problem, they said, well, we've decided we're going to create our new FedNow real-time payment system to solve the problem, which will take us at least 5 years. Oh, and on that other stuff about improving the hours of our existing facilities, we're going to keep thinking about that. And if you just paid attention to what I've said, you would be as irate as I am about what amounts to a Fed's decision to make all those poor schlemiels keep on waiting for their paychecks to settle for another 5 years, so they can toy with a new payment system that isn't needed to accomplish that goal.
So everybody, please get your picket signs and storm out. We need to increase the hours.
FedWire and the National Settlement Service 24/7, 365, and tell the Fed they shouldn't mess around with anything till they can get that done.
There we go. Easy solution. That's what we can hope for.
Low tech sometimes is the answer, but when you have people who are married to an idea, in this case, the Fed's fetish has been to have this get involved in real-time retail payments. They don't want anything to stand in the way of that. And I know this is a terrible, cynical sounding thing to say, but I believe they want those workers to keep on having to wait for their paychecks, because they want them to start saying, oh, I can't wait for the Fed to finish FedNow. We need it so badly, because they won't realize that there's a simple solution at hand that could solve the problem now and not in 5 years. So I think that's what the Fed is doing. It's holding us hostage to make us want a system we don't need. by not letting us have a system we do need right away that it could provide.
Interesting. Well, yeah, that is a sort of remarkable suggestion that it's so simple yet it's so under discussed. And I recommend everyone go check out your Twitter thread where you kind of go into a little bit more detail about it, and any other writings that you have.
Well, if they want to read something longer and more tedious, as these things tend to be, they can find my recent written congressional testimony online. A testimony for a hearing called Facilitating Faster Payments in the U.S., which was held on September 25th. So the written testimony they can find. They can also listen to the whole hearing, where I give my testimony in a 5-minute summary. And among other things, they can hear a truly horrendous opening statement by the ranking Democratic member of the committee, Sherrod Brown, who utterly misrepresents all the facts about the fast payment problem. I'll be writing about that soon on Altem.
Great. And do you have any other projects or writings that you want to plug right now?
Oh, goodness. Well, I have one that I'll mention. I have been concerned about the fact that, the Fed has this huge balance sheet, and it's probably going to be getting bigger now very soon. And the fact that it can get bigger and that there's pressure on the Fed to make it so creates a very serious possibility that politicians will want to treat the Fed's balance sheet as a fiscal plaything, and advance programs, very big spending programs that the Fed will be asked to finance by buying special bonds and that sort of thing. I've got a long paper coming out called The Menace of Fiscal QE, which is about this danger and what I think the Fed needs to do to put a stop to it. So that's one of my projects. Yeah, I'll just mention that one.
Great. Well, everybody, you can catch all those projects. We'll link it in the description below. And please follow George on Twitter and all the other platforms that he's available. And you can keep up with these ideas and the work that he's doing. And so, George, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Great.